Those that can have like a type and everything. Well, just talking about supplies, right? Then do that. Yeah. Okay. And then you could also do. Oh, so that's why I was like, it doesn't matter if you want to. Thank you so much. No problem.
I heard your writing, right? Yes. Okay. Starting in summer. Right. Yeah, yeah.
You want to go ahead and screen share now?
And it's due, when will it be due? So I know. Almost. Yeah. I promise I will be.
Is this already? This is what you would screen share to everyone. Right there. Yeah. This is what we're about to review. Yeah, that's all right. Perfect. Thank you so much. No problem.
It's like a thermite now when I teach I worked long enough where it's like you start a shift with a dozen I wonder if they could start making $10 butters if you walk outside of the restaurant. Like those, yeah, other things. Yeah. Yeah. I like imagine how it's like you walk through the doors of the restaurant and it's the auto whatever or like a rag stash this. Actually, that in my college, they, you know, the students push for like getting rid of the plastic ware.
All right. Everybody hear me? Hey, we hear me back there, right? The front is right here. All right. Hello? All right. So now everybody online to hear me? Great. Awesome. All right. So welcome to the Ethics and Research and Methods colloquium talk. This is the first one that I've ever done in person. It's nice to see everybody face to face or mask to mask, I suppose. Yeah, this is going to be a really awesome talk. It's a collaboration. This one with a number of different departments and organizations. The Global Indigenous Forum, also the UGS, the Graduate School, Department of History, DARCSA, and SAGSA, the Sociology, Anthropology, Geography Graduate Student Association. We collaborated to put this talk together. I'm not really going to talk for that long. I just appreciate everybody coming, everybody streaming in online for the webinar. And thank you very much for coming. And I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Diane Benitez. Thank you.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm going to read our land acknowledgement. This is a shortened version, so if you would like to know more, go to local Indigenous form. We'd like to take a few minutes to acknowledge that our university is located on the ancestral homelands of the sovereign Native nations, including the Pesta, Calusa, and today the Seminole Tribe of Florida and the Tribe of Indian Florida. I hope that acknowledging the land helps us to better understand the harm that has been done and address the legacies of violence in our communities in order to create a pathway to true healing. We pay our respects to the traditional custodians of the land, the elders, both past and present, by fully recognizing Indigenous sovereignty, as well as the historical and contemporary relationship between Indigenous people and their traditional homeland. We encourage our university community to read and learn more about ways to support our local Indigenous communities in their efforts to preserve Seminole and Miccosukee land and water rights, cultural practices, and the conservation of the environment. At FIU, we hold ourselves accountable to serving local, regional, and worldwide Indigenous communities through academic, policy-oriented research, education, partnerships, community service, as well as enrollment initiatives to overcome the effects of Indigenous exclusion and erasure at our own academic institutions. We encourage you to take full action, not just performative allyship. You can do this in many ways. One of them is by becoming acquainted with Love the Everglades movement, who is trying to preserve our Everglades, and they are reaching out in an artistic way. On February 9th, they will be having an event at Light Arts on 924 Lincoln Road. It's a great way to get out there, see the arts, and get involved in our community. You can also go to the Global Indigenous Forum website and learn more about past and upcoming events. I'll pass this along to Missy. I'm getting an info.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is exciting. This is our first in-person event since the pandemic. So thank you all for coming out. We were sure if people actually show up, so it's very exciting. Thank you to SATSA, which is our graduate student group from GSS. And as Lucas, I don't think you introduced yourself as the president of SATSA. And I see a lot of the SATSA folks here today, so thank you all for all your help. You brought us water, so help yourselves. We are really delighted to welcome Kelly Fayard, who is here with us from the University of Denver. She is an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Denver. She earned her BA in cultural anthropology and religion from Duke University. And she has a certificate in museum studies as well as her MA and PhD in anthropology from the University of Michigan. Her research is really interesting. She deals primarily with Poarch Creek Indians in southern Alabama, where she is an enrolled citizen. Before moving to the University of Denver, Dr. Fayard was an assistant dean of Yale College and the director of Native American Cultural Center. She moved to New Haven following a year at the School of Advanced Research in Santa Fe, where she held the Anne Ray Fellowship and continued her ethnographic studies in the Poarch Creek community there. Her research deals primarily with the Poarch Band of Creek Indians in southern Alabama. As she's writing a book manuscript entitled Fighting to Belong, Race, Kinship, and Community Among the Poarch Band of Creek Indians, which examines the methods and actions the Poarch Creek used to define themselves as Creek, given all the stereotypes and assumptions about what it means to claim an Indian identity. I actually got a chance to read one of your articles today on back porch politics. And it was great. I was really intrigued by the way that Dr. Fayard explores the use and misuse of Indigenous heritage in the conservative Bible Belt of Alabama, and how Poarch PR campaigns are also shaped to challenge some of those stereotypical ideas of Indianness. how some of the PR campaigns are also challenged to adequately address some of the settlement colonial frameworks. So it's quite interesting work. But today she's going to be talking more about ethics and research and methods from a native anthropological perspective. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Fayard to our campus.
Well, thank you everybody for being here. I'm really excited just to be in the presence of people now that we are able to travel a little bit more. So this has been really fun for me, just traveling and meeting people. I do want to make a note. I can't see any of my presenter notes, so I'm going to try to remember everything that I wanted to tell you. But if I fumble a little bit, then please bear with me. I did want to do a land acknowledgement, but you did such a great job. It's so heartwarming to know that there's an institutional land acknowledgement. And I did just want to mention that I'm coming here from the University of Denver, which is on the homelands of the Cheyenne and Arapaho people. Denver was a really important place at the confluence of the Platte Rivers and Cherry Creek. And not just the Cheyenne and Arapaho, but the Ute and 49 other indigenous groups found that place really important. So that's where I'm coming here from. And I'm really, really happy to be a visitor here on these lands. So thank you so much. So this is just kind of an outline of the talk. I want to talk a little bit about the apology that the AAA president gave in November of 2021. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about anthropology as a colonial discipline. I wanted to talk a little bit about the ethical issues that I've encountered both in my research and in my jobs at various institutions. So there's going to be a little bit of trash talking in here. I hope you're not afraid of that. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about what anthropology can learn from Native communities. And then at the end, I'm going to talk through some tips that I have of working with communities, Indigenous or non. You know, I think that they can be applied to any community that someone is doing research in. So this is the apology from the AAA president. You know, he took, by Dr. Akhil Gupta, he took a lot of time to talk through the reasons why anthropology needs to apologize to Indigenous communities. You know, a lot of the lines that I really appreciate where the anthropologists have often assigned themselves the status of an expert over communities, over Indigenous communities in particular, and that this apology is just one step in the direction of trying to make things right with these Indigenous communities. And one of the things that the AAA has done recently is that if you are an enrolled tribal citizen, then the AAA will waive your conference fee to attend the national big anthropology conference. And I think that it's just really interesting the way in which this apology happens. But why was he apologizing? I mean, he has a lot of, you know, really great points here of why it is important to apologize to Indigenous communities, but I thought we could talk a little bit about that first. So the first thing I have is Here Come the Anthros, which is a song by Floyd Westerman, and hopefully you can hear that. Listen to the lyrics. Think about what stands out to you.
The Anthros feel become like death and taxes. To study their feathered freaks with one bit money in their hand. Like Sunday after Zoom, the gallows should go away. Making hopes of every morning among animals that way. Here comes the Anthros, I can pass away. Here comes the Anthros, all another holiday. And the Anthros bring the friends to see the sun just watch the show. And when the heads are untied, back up the things that way they go. But there's nothing left to study, there's nothing left to see. Still the Anthros And the farm made money, that the Anthro didn't spend. The herd given to their disappearing feathered friend. Here in country Anthro, and happy passed away. Here in country Anthro, all the other all day. And the Anthros keep on digging on our state ceremonial site. As if there was nothing wrong with education given the right. But the more they keep on digging, the less they really see. As they got no respect for you or for me. Here in country Anthro, happy passed away. Here in country Anthro, all the other all day.
So here are the lyrics. And I wondered if anybody heard a phrase or something that stood out to them from this song. Yeah. The more they dig, the less they see. Absolutely. What else? I think I saw some things over here. Yeah. What education gives them the right. Good one. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah, so this song was actually written in conjunction with Custer Died for Your Sins, which was published in 1969. And I always assign anthropologists and other friends for literally every anthropology class that I teach, because I think it is such an interesting kind of look at what anthropology means to Indigenous people, the way in which Indigenous communities have been abused, and really a lot of extractive anthropology has been used, where exactly like the song says, people go in, take what they need, go write about it. And something that Vine Deloria talks a lot about is, you know, people having these ideas about what Indigenous communities are and what they stand for, and then going and basically using confirmation bias to reify what they already knew, right? So if you've read that, then you know the way that he talks about that. But he also says that the fundamental thesis of anthropologists, I'm going to see if I can move this out of the way so you can see better. The fundamental thesis of the anthropologist is that people are objects for observation, for experimentation, that's double, for manipulation and for eventual extinction. The anthropologist thus furnishes the justification for treating Indian people like so many chessmen available for anyone to play with. So he has like a lot of damning things to say about anthropology, but with good reason, okay? And so these are just like a few of the very good reasons to think about the reason why anthropology has been such a burden on Indigenous communities. So when you look at people like Lewis Henry Morgan, who is considered to be like a sort of founder, like before anthropology was even anthropology, when you think about the kinship studies that he's done. And to be fair, like I think Lewis Henry Morgan was way ahead of his time when he was doing his research and thinking through like what it means to be related and talking about kinship and that sort of thing. But when he was little, he was sick. So his parents sent him to upstate New York to, you know, get the vapors or whatever it is up there. And a Seneca woman up there helped raise him. And that's the reason why he got really interested in working with Indigenous communities. And it's also like the entry point into kinship studies that he began by kind of going through the community that he had made connections with there. But then he forms an organization. In the beginning, it was called the Gordian Knot. It eventually turns into the Grand Order of the Iroquois, and it was all about playing Indian. They gave each other Indian names. They wore hooped around fires. Like there was all this very stereotypical kind of things that they were doing as a part of this organization. Then we think about Franz Boas, and Franz Boas obviously did a lot of things that helped develop anthropology in the United States. Anthropology in the United States. You know, we think of him as the father of American anthropology, sort of the person who made the four-field approach in the United States a thing. But he also asked Admiral Peary, when he was doing his North explorations, to bring back some Inuit. And Peary did, and he didn't just bring one person, he brought 6, one of those being a small boy. These folks were living in the basement of the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. 4 died from tuberculosis within a year, and Boaz actually staged a funeral for the boy's father, and pretended like he buried him, and actually went and dissected the body, kept the bones, and did those sorts of things with his remains. And then we have a ton of examples like E. Evans Pritchard, who looked at indigenous communities in East Africa simply because he wanted to help the British government figure out a way to better contain the areas in which they were trying to expand their reach. So, the problem is that a lot of the ways in which these old school anthropologists thought about indigenous communities, that still is alive and well in our discipline today. Anybody who tells you that it isn't, doesn't understand the way in which colonial legacy works. That the fact that our discipline is so based in this colonial logic means that those kinds of issues are going to be there. And that's the reason why it's been so heartening to meet with the grad students today and to talk to some of y'all to hear about the kinds of classes that you're taking on decolonization and things like that, and just like the critical lens that you're looking at, not just what you're reading, but also the kind of classes that you're taking. Because I do know that in our discipline, there are still bad anthropologists training bad students. I mean, just for an example, I met somebody at the AAAs who was a newly minted Ph.D. who was telling me that maybe I don't need to worry about PR campaigns, should I be more worried about alcoholism in indigenous communities? I mean, this is at the Professional Anthropology Conference, right? And so while I do think that anthropology has come a long way, there is still a really long way to go. So one of the pieces that I love to think about when I'm thinking about the development of anthropology is Sylvia Yanagisako's work in Unwrapping the Sacred Bundle. She was a co-editor on that. And then the chapter that she wrote is called Flexible Disciplinarity Beyond the Americanist Tradition. And there she argues that the reason why the United States is the only place where anthropology is a core field is because it was really all about the settler colonial logic of knowing the Native American other, which is really fascinating. If you've never read this, please do it because it is fascinating. And I can send people PDFs if you email me because I have it as a PDF. But she also argues that anthropology was shaped by this national history of settler colonialism and the way in which the racializing process happened around national identity formation. She quotes Adams from 1998 saying, "I have long been convinced that the unifying cement of American anthropology, which brings a certain coherence to all its disparate parts, is not any particular body or practice, but simply the, quote, possession of the American Indian as its main field of study." And what she says in the piece is that just like English majors are meant to study Shakespeare, so too must anthropologists study Indians. So when you look at kind of the trajectory of the discipline from Boaz at Columbia and see the ways in which the discipline sort of develops out of that, putting it in conversation with settler colonialism, I think is really interesting. Because one of the other things that she talks about is how when you're thinking about a settler colonial logic, it's all about erasing the indigenous population and replacing it. What she's saying is with archaeology, you are literally removing the history of this continent from the ground and replacing it with white stories about indigenous people or non-native stories about indigenous people. So my question is, can we talk about decolonization of a discipline that is in and of itself the most colonial thing on the planet? And that's not to say that other disciplines aren't colonial. It's just to say that this is the one that I know about, and it is incredibly colonial. And what does it mean to say we're going to decolonize that? It's the same thing with museums. When people talk about decolonizing museums, what does that mean? Museums are an inherently colonial project. So what does it mean to decolonize something that's very identity is colonial? And just thinking through, what would a truly decolonized Department of Anthropology look like? And so what does it mean to talk about or think about ethics and research if we are committed to decolonizing? And one of those things that I really like to think about is the idea of decanonizing. And so what I mean by that is, I have a link here to the syllabus, but this has been so hard. that I'm just going to not send that, but if you just Google decolonizing syllabus and anthropology, this blog will come up. It was a project of some graduate students to create a decolonized syllabus. What that means is the emphasis is not on the people that we usually think of as the founders and the real sort of bedrock of the discipline, but thinking through people like Ella DeLoria, Zora Neale Hurston, two women of color who were trained by Boaz in the same way that Benedict and Mead are, and yet we never talk about them, right? So it's thinking through like the way in which we teach anthropology and whose voices we value and really amplify in that way, as opposed to just teaching what we've always taught. The other thing is that Dr. Bianca Williams has, along with some other scholars, come up with the hashtag Cite Black Women. And I think that that really is important when we're thinking about decolonizing, is citing voices who have been marginalized and who are now able to publish and who now have a platform. So just making sure that we are centering those voices and not the same old people that we always center, right? And then the last thing I think about, if we're thinking about ethics and research, is how to practice what Eve Tuck calls desire-centered research. And she defines that in opposition to damage-centered research. She talks a lot in the article from 2009 about how most things that you read about Native communities are all damage-based. The poverty, the this, the that, and none of the really resilient, kind of wonderful things about Indigenous communities, but instead the lack of those things in the damage-centered research. So that's another thing that I think about when we're thinking about what it looks like to decolonize in our ethics and research. This is a little bit about my work. So I'm a member of the Poarch Creek Indians. It's in southern Alabama, very close to the Alabama-Florida line. So when I go home, I fly into Pensacola. And the person who's being hidden by this box is Tony Paredes, who was an anthropologist who began working with my tribal community in the 1960s. And one of the things that has been so amazing about having an anthropologist who has a history with my community is that when he was interviewing people in the 1960s, he was actually doing interviews with people who were alive in the 1800s, okay? And so that is like amazing, right? That's so cool. And I've known him, or I knew him, he is no longer with us, but I knew him from the time I can ever remember. Every Thanksgiving Day and the day after, we have our annual Thanksgiving powwow. He was at every single one. And when my mom told him, like, oh, by the way, Kelly's majoring in anthropology at Duke, he was like super excited. And I thought it was cool that he was an anthropologist until I took a Native North American class and decided that I was going to write my research paper on my tribe. And so I knew that there were these articles and book chapters that he had written, and I decided to go ahead and read those. And I got super mad. Like, when you're like 20 and you have all the energy in the world and you can just be mad. That was me. And so I go to my advisor's office and I'm like, what can I do to, write back against this? Like, I need to somehow work on this story. And my advisor said, well, you're going to have to get a Ph.D. in anthropology. And I was like, what about Native studies? And he's like, anthropologists don't read Native studies, which was very true at the time. I think it is changing now, but it was very true at the time. So I called my Ph.D. a spite Ph.D. because it was really driven by like this anger and like energy to be able to kind of write against some of the things that he had been claiming about my community. We made friends later, but it was after a trial. Like, there were a lot of issues, including the fact that the first time I saw him at the annual anthropology meetings, he walked up to me and said, well, I just never thought I'd see the day of Poarch Creek was at the AAAs. And like, you might take that as like, oh, he means well, but it also felt really demeaning and condescending at the same time, especially being, one of very few Native people at those conferences. So one of the other interactions that I had with him, and I think this is one finally when we came to a certain kind of piece, was that I do have a museum studies certificate from Michigan as well. And part of my program was that I worked for my tribal museum for a while to get experience in a museum setting. And Tony came in one day with all of these CDs. He had digitized a lot of his tapes and put them onto these CDs. And you know, being in this museum, I was thinking, great. You know, we have these like really amazing facilities now. The tribe had just built this museum, like awesome, let's get copies of these so we can put these in the archives and like keep those. And he said, no, I've already decided that I'm going to put my papers and everything into the National Archive. So yeah, I'm not going to be able to give you a copy. And I was like, you know what, that's fine. I'll go to DC if I have to and record every single one of them. No big deal. I was seething at the time because he had also asked if we needed a translator for one of the tapes, even though the people who were listening all grew up in the community, and so it wasn't like, you know, I mean, they were speaking English. It was just very Southern, like accented English, but it wasn't like this was something that we couldn't understand. So he knew I was mad. I'm not very good at hiding my emotions, and so I think it was pretty obvious. So 2 weeks later, he calls me at the museum and he says, Kelly, my best friend just fell off of a ladder and died. I've been thinking about my own mortality. I just want you to know, I just sent you a box of CDs for you to put in the archives in Poarch. And it was from then that I think we started kind of healing our relationship. I also was not a nice person in my dissertation to him. And in my first job, he asked me to send him a copy of it. And it was at that moment that I was thinking to myself, you know what, I could have been a little more graceful in the way that I interacted with him and also in the way that I wrote about him in the dissertation. So I held my breath and hit send. And the only thing he wrote back to me was, Kelly, I think we agree a lot more than you think we do. And so that's just to say that, you know, a lot of pushback, I think that I gave him ended up changing his mind about a lot of things. And so even though he was this old school guy, he still had the capacity to think through the critiques that I was giving to him and think about the ways in which he could change his approach. And I think that we ended up like coming to an agreement on how to work together, because when he died, we were working on a paper together for a conference. So, you know, I think that it was fine by the time that he passed, but it was a very fraught relationship until then. But I did do research in my own community, and that comes with a lot of pros and cons. But I wanted to make sure I was doing it in a way that I was going to be proud of. And so part of that meant that even though it was a community that I grew up in, I still consulted with people to see what they wanted from an anthropological project. This wasn't just my research, it was my community's research. It was research that I was doing on behalf of everybody who was there and everybody who lives there. And some of the pros were really, really pro. Like if I would be like, hey, mama, who do I talk to about this? And she would say, oh, go talk to so-and-so. Or if my mom didn't know, I'd ask my grandmother. She didn't know, I'd ask my aunt, right? So it was like really easy to make connections. But some of the cons are that it's real personal, okay? And so it's not like I can pull a Nancy Shepherd Hughes and write some really bad things about the community, because that's where I go home to, right? Like Denver is not my home. I go home to Alabama, right? And so it was really fraught a lot of times. And I had a lot of times when I had decided I am never working with my community again because of the kind of political issues that I was having to navigate, that somebody who wasn't from that community would have an easier time doing. So I do think that there's like a balance between the pros and cons for working in a community that's your own. So it's just something to think about. All right, so when I got to the University of Michigan, and this is, you know, after I already had all my anger, I found out within the first couple of weeks that I was there that there was a large amount of native human remains being stored in a field house by the Michigan Stadium. And And this was something that I had never really thought about before, because at Duke, our departments were split. So there's a cultural anthropology department specifically, and that's what I majored in. I wasn't thinking about biological anthropology or anatomy, or I wasn't thinking about archaeology in that way, because I had been in this specific cultural community and background. So I find out about these remains, and I am legit like torn apart. I remember like crying for a week because I just wasn't sure like how to react to that. Added to the fact that there was this Native grad student from the American Studies program who decided I was a mole, and we were the best of friends now, but she made me cry a lot because she was saying like, why would you, as a Native person, why would you be in anthropology? You know, and there was a lot of pushback from other Native grad students as to why I would be in a discipline like anthropology. But it was, you know, it was a time when I, you know, honestly was like, I don't know why I'm in anthropology. Like, I want to try to change some of the things that have been written about my community, but what else is it that I need to do to make this discipline a place that I can be proud of having a diploma from? And so part of that was pushing to have these over 1,400 remains returned to the Indigenous communities in Michigan. Because there are a lot of stories, and this is one of the worst ones. But in 1938, this professor named Emerson Greenman, it was during the Depression, goes up into Canada and pays someone to show him where an Indian cemetery is. This is not a burial ground. These are like named graves that had been buried not that long ago, right? And so he digs up 18 people. And because he is worried about what's going to happen at the border with all of these bodies, he mails them to himself in Ann Arbor. And the problem is that there are all these remains. These are in addition to the ones that have been taken from Michigan, but nobody is doing anything with them. They're stored in these cardboard boxes out by the stadium. And the tribes in Michigan were trying to get them returned, as was the Whitefish River Band that began talking in 1983 with the university about getting those returned. It wasn't until March of 2005 that they actually were returned, but that was like the beginning of a more interesting process at the University of Michigan. But why were these people there so intent on keeping those remains? I honestly don't understand this. This is something that, you know, I had conversations with other grad students. While this was going on, the Native grad students came together and kind of created this push against the administration. Because I don't know if you know this, students, but you were the most powerful people at this university. It might not feel like it, but you can do a lot of things and get away with it, like we did. But, you know, part of the issue was that Michigan wasn't in compliance with the NAGPRA law, which was passed in 1990. But I didn't understand. And so I remember asking this one woman that I knew, you know, why do you consider this to be yours? Like, why do you claim it as yours? Why are you okay with like this sort of thinking? And I remember her saying, look, I do archaeology in Romania, and that's where my family is from. So if I dig up anybody's grandmother, it's my own, and I really don't care. And to me, I was just like, this is the opposite of how I feel. And, you know, I think part of it is that for a lot of Native communities, we really draw connections to our kin for multiple generations. And so, you know, it was really hard to kind of hear that. But part of the problem is that the curator of North America at the time had decided that nothing should be returned because of this loophole in it was issue 10.11 of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which said that if something was culturally unidentifiable, then it didn't need to be returned. So what does he do? He says, oh yeah, our entire North American collection is culturally unidentifiable. Even though, so he says this, and the tribes say, you know what, we're going to come together and create this cultural preservation organization with all of the state and federally recognized tribes in the state of Michigan. Then you can just return it to us, and we'll reinter them, and that way you don't have to pick a group. But none of this ever worked. And eventually, what happens is that the vice president of research at the university takes the power of repatriation decisions and places it with a board that was composed of Native faculty members, Native students, and Native community members. But that took a lot of energy, y'all, and I just don't think it should be that hard to do the right thing, okay? But that's when I'm talking about like the coloniality of our discipline. These are the kinds of examples I have. Then we go to my first tenure track job, where there was blatant racism within the department. And this is the department, the only department on campus that was talking about race, gender, sexuality, those kinds of things. But I encountered such hostility towards students of color in this situation if they didn't, act like what WASPy understandings of intelligence are. If they didn't kind of perform that intelligence, then faculty members would completely dismiss them. So I left, and everybody told me I was crazy. So then I get to Yale. I was assistant dean of Yale College. I was the director of the Native American Cultural Center. And while at Yale, the issue of the Yale Peabody comes up. And the person who is running that museum is a frog biologist. That is very important to know. So when I went to have a conversation with them about the fact on the third floor of the Peabody Museum, it was like the natural environment of Connecticut. And so it'd be like trees, bushes, deer, Indian man with no clothes on, okay? And so, in trying to have a conversation about like the issues around something like this, he yelled at me. That was real fun. But the other thing that they did in this museum, and there is currently being renovated, so fingers crossed it like gets better, but was that they had like the whole cultural evolution kind of set up in a circular motion. So it went like, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, whatever, Polynesians, Native people, and that was it. But the only people who were being represented in that museum, in the Museum of Natural History, the Peabody Museum of Natural History, were Polynesians and Native North Americans, nobody else. So when we're also thinking about the ways in which museums, anthropology contribute to these like understandings of like indigenous communities, we have to think about the context and the way in which we're presenting those things. So a lot of people mad at Yale, but at the end of the day, I'm going to talk about this in a second. At the end of the day, isn't it better to have people mad at you and you can live with yourself and go sleep at night? That's what I think. Okay, so fast forward now, I'm at the University of Denver, founded by John Evans, also the founder of Northwestern University in Evanstown, Illinois. John Evans was the governor of Colorado when the Sand Creek Massacre occurs. If you don't know anything about that, it was late 1800s. The Cheyenne and Arapaho folks had a treaty with the government, and as a part of that treaty, they were given a place to camp, and they were camping under a white flag, which means that they're peaceful, they have already signed a treaty, they're in the place they're supposed to be. Shivington, who was a military leader at the time, goes to the camp and kills everyone. Men, women, children. He is the guy who coined the phrase "nits make lice," and so that was the reason why they killed women and children, because nits make lice, and he was trying to get rid of everybody. He didn't succeed because we have thriving Cheyenne and Arapaho communities in Montana, Wyoming, and Oklahoma today. But it was a really horrific situation. This is also how one of the medical science museum, something about the Army and something about medical, they created this museum by collecting the body parts of people who were a part of the Sand Creek Massacre. And those body parts were used for things like measuring brain size and that sort of thing at the time. So on the anniversary of the founding of Northwestern, the faculty decided to form a committee to think about, is John Evans culpable in the Sand Creek Massacre? Their faculty say no. But the following couple of years, when it was the University of Denver's anniversary, the faculty pushed to have, the same kind of investigation. And the faculty at DU do find John Evans culpable because he was the governor of Colorado at the time. And even though he wasn't there actually shooting people and killing people, he knew what was up and he knew some bad things were about to happen, and did nothing about it. So now the University of Denver has published this thing called the Evans Report, and it kind of lays out the way in which the university has contributed to the settler colonialism of the West, and also the diminishment of any power by the diminishment of sovereignty of local Native communities. So it's been really interesting to be there, to be in a place that has kind of a policy around the way in which they're going to work with Indigenous communities, and also the, putting an emphasis on recruiting and maintaining good relationships with Native students, not just Cheyenne and Arapaho, but around the country. But recently, the University of Denver was given a mountain campus. It's, beautiful Rocky Mountain. It was a former Girl Scout camp. Some rich person donated the money to buy the campus. And at this point, the way in which that is working is that the university is looking to the Department of Anthropology to help them figure out what tribal consultation looks like. And it's kind of messy. Like, people at the university don't necessarily know what it's like to work with Indigenous communities. But the fact that they're trying, I think, is a really good step. It makes me feel better about where I am. So one of the things that I just kind of wanted to end with is just thinking through, like, what your own ethical guidelines are. The institutions that you end up at, this institution, I actually don't know anything about your institution here, so I'm not necessarily talking trash about them, but institutions don't care about you, first of all. But you need to think about the fact that the institutions that you become part of don't necessarily share the same ethical considerations that you do. And so I think for me, like, people call me the Indian bitch sometimes, and you know what? I'm okay with that, because if you're going to be talking some racist stuff, then that's fine. I will fulfill your need for that person in the room. And it's really hard a lot of times to go up against people, especially as an assistant professor, or even as a non-academic at Yale. It's really, it can be really difficult. But there are people like you, and there are allies. And I think that was one of the things that I've learned throughout the different institutions that I've worked at, is that you'll find allies in, like, the most random places. Okay. When I was at Michigan, one of the most supportive people that was there when it came to repatriation was a Jewish guy from Israel who was like, I don't want to graduate with a diploma from a place that holds Native remains like this. And it was kind of like, really? It was a moment where I realized that there were people who would do the right thing, even if it didn't personally benefit them. So make sure that you are thinking about that. And then, like I said earlier, as students, you have a lot of power. So anything that you can do to push the university or the institution that you're a part of to be better, you are the most protected people that are here. So just remember that. If you're a tenured faculty member, I would hope that you would be watching out for your junior colleagues, because a lot of us put ourselves on the line to do what we think is right. And it's nice when there are senior colleagues who are able to back you up. I feel like at the University of Denver, my department is amazing. There are all of these tenured full professors who I feel like completely have my back in a way I have never experienced at any other institution. And then, the other thing that I would say is that if you're unhappy and you're in a toxic place, you have to be ready to leave. I think that so many people try to tell students, like, if you land this job, or if you get this job, or if this happened, that you won the golden ticket, you should shut up and just put your nose to the grindstone and get it done. But I don't believe that. I was miserable in my first job. Everybody acted like I had won the golden ticket, and that if I was, like, losing it if I left. But it has turned out to be the best decision I could have ever made. I got a ton of experience when I was at Yale, and everybody will also tell you that if you leave an academic position, you can't get another one. And I'm here to tell you that's a lie, because I got one. So I think that you should feel the power to follow your heart, as cheesy as that might sound. Okay, and this is my last slide. So my tips for working with Indigenous or non-communities: number one, don't be a jerk, okay? I've seen so many people who approach community work as if they know it all and as if they are better than the people that they're working with. And I've even seen like current graduate students at various institutions act like this. It is really important to approach a community with respect, but more importantly, humility. Okay, you're asking something from them. You want to work with them. So think about that. And going along with that, just understand that when you're working with a community, you're putting a tax on that community. You might not necessarily recognize it at the time, but as somebody who comes from a community where people are always doing mission work or other kinds of things like that, there is an unseen tax that is kind of a cost to the community that you're working with. So just be aware of that. Recognize that when people are talking to you, it means that they're not spending time with their families or they're not able to, work for their living or whatever. And as you probably know, the anthropology guideline for doing work is do no harm. But I think beyond doing no harm, I think it is really important for us to think about how we can actively support these communities and we can actively make a difference in whatever way that they need. Also be an ally, but what this means is the community gets to tell you what your role is in that, okay? This is not a white savior situation. It's not, I'm not saying like you need to go in there and help those people. No, you need to ask them what they need from you. And you need to listen when they tell you. I think we saw a lot of that kind of issue around the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's not that people don't want you to support them. It's more that you can't take over if you're not a member of that community. And you need to listen when people tell you what your role should be. This is my last point, and I'm using the term woke. I know people are like sick of this term, but this is one of the most important things that I've been thinking about recently, is that being woke is not an event. You don't get to wokeness and then say, okay, I'm done. Being woke is a process. And it's something that you have to strive for every single day. And I think that we don't talk enough about that. People are so afraid of being labeled some kind of ist, racist, sexist, homophobic, like all of these kinds of things. But I think that, there are things that we struggle with as humans, our own biases, and everybody has them, okay? I was raised in the deep South. I deal with anti-Black racism every single day. It's something that I have to actively work on to make sure that the kind of structural and institutional racism that I was raised in doesn't become a part of who I am or a part of my work, right? And I think we just need to be honest with each other about where our biases are, where our struggles are, and how we're going to work for the liberation of everybody. So that's all I got. Thank you.
Requirement of the way that you weave together, the personal and political, and really kind of high ethics in this way.
I thought that was phenomenal, and I really appreciated what you shared with us on so many levels. I know that we have a lot of comments on the webinar for the people who are tuning in online. And we're gonna pass, Tiffany here is with SAGSA, MITA, awesome. She's gonna be passing the mic around. And I don't know if we mentioned before at the very beginning that this is also sponsored to Global Indigenous Forum and to SIBA, the Green School, and UGS and GSS and History. So thank you for all of our co-sponsors who brought Dr. Fayard here for this awesome talk. Any questions here?
Thank you. Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation, your talk. I think it was very illuminating. I feel I have learned a lot.
what caught my interest was the mention you made of your mention of the Peabody diorama. So I don't remember who says this. No, I actually do. So I don't know if you've ever heard of Slovene philosopher Slavoj Žižek, by any chance? Give me 1 second.
I took out my mind, so it's not.
Okay.
It's not that. I don't
It is in my phone. Yeah, sure. Sure. Okay. So he's a contemporary philosopher. It doesn't matter. Just that he has an anecdote where he's speaking with like Native Americans from the U.S. and how they dislike this term Native American, and how it implies that if they are Native Americans, then what are the other Americans? Are they cultural Americans? So what caught my attention again is the category of culture. I think that it has theoretical and ethical ramifications that must be discussed, especially anthropology, because my culture is the big category, right? How has your experience led you to reflect on the category of culture, or how have you involved with in your experience with reflections regarding culture? In my personal opinion, I think that divide between cultural person and the native natural person still stems from the 18th century philosophy of use naturalism, right? Of Rousseau and Buffon and the philosophical origins of anthropology, even before people like Taylor and so on and so forth. So I wanted to ask you, how have you dealt with that category in your experience?
Yeah, that's a doozy right there.
I know.
And that's a big question. I think, it is so important to be asking those kinds of questions of these categories that we take for granted, right? And I think a lot, because I'm really obsessed with kinship studies. And so I think about the way in which David Schneider really critiques the idea of kinship. And basically, in the 1980s, he says, we shouldn't even be talking about kinship because it is so based in this Western assumption of biology that we can't even talk about this without talking about these sort of, like you're saying, like these 19th century understandings of what it means to be related to somebody, going all the way back to Lewis Henry Morgan. But I do think that there are places where, we can, so I think it's really important first to question and interrogate those categories. And I think that when we do that, it makes us all better thinkers, because out of that David Schneider critique comes with all of these amazing feminist anthropologists who are talking about, okay, let's not talk about the biology, let's talk about relatedness and the process of becoming related. So I think that is a good example of what might happen if we interrogated the concept of culture, which is really interesting. But the other thing that I think about when it comes to the idea of culture is the way in which anthropologists have been gatekeepers around who is culturally authentic and who isn't. This is something that I think a lot about because in being from a tribe that's in the southeastern United States, where there was long sustained contact with explorers and settlers and everything before, before the West, it means that we've lost a lot of things, language, in particular. But does that mean that we are any less authentic in quotes, right? So when I think about your question, that's what I immediately go to is like this really, constructed idea of what is authentic and what isn't. And we can still see that when we talk about culture, right? Like, is it pure? Is it valid? And so, but that's also one of the reasons why I love anthropology is because you find anthropologists who are studying any of these different things. But that doesn't change the way that we're talking about it.
And so I don't think I have a really good answer for your question, but I think it's an amazing like thought journey to think through that.
There's a very cool cartoon where there's a stereotypical like like Pacific Islander people, and they have their TV, you know, the
Yes.
radio, and they're all the anthropologists are coming.
The far side, isn't that the far side?
Yeah.
I use that in my lectures. I know exactly what you're talking about.
So, and I think that it has lots of ethical consequences.
Yeah, and I will also say that part of what my work is understanding a little bit of that. For in the case of my tribe, Indians playing Indian. Because in the 1950s, when we were going for federal recognition, people were so caught up in the stereotypes of what a Native person looked like, that if you didn't have on a headdress, then you weren't Indian. So it meant that in my tribal community, the person who was going to DC the most to kind of work towards federal acknowledgement, he wore a war bonnet when he went, which is not a tradition in the Southeast, right? Well, what does that mean? Does it make him look any less authentic? Does it mean that he's just playing into these stereotypes, or is he using what he thought was the best way to be seen as an Indigenous person to his benefit, right? I mean, the other thing that's really interesting about him is that George Wallace, the guy who blocked the University of Alabama from Black people entering, loved him. Loved taking pictures with him. There's all these pictures of them, like, you know, George Wallace having his arm around him. Like, it is fascinating. And so I just think that, you know, thinking about what you're saying, it just really is making me think about a lot of other stuff too. Thank you for that.
Oh, okay. So this is probably wrong of an answer, but maybe briefly you can. I was curious about hearing, since you were talking more about your post-dissertation work, I was interested in hearing how you went about going back to Alabama as a, you know, ABD graduate student and identifying a project that they found useful and that you found also interesting and thought would be interesting to your advisors and all of that too.
Yeah, so when I went back, first of all, everybody was like floored because my parents I got my own apartment. What are you doing? I mean, there's just like all kinds of fraughtness about moving back and doing this project. But I moved back and I started interviewing, or I started conversations with a lot of the elders, like, what do you think would be most helpful? I would talk to a lot of the leadership in the tribal government as well. Like, what does it look like? What do you need? And so what I heard from them is that, you know, a lot of our elders are dying. We want like this history, kind of like what you were talking about at lunch. We want this history of how we got federally acknowledged. So I started my dissertation fieldwork in January of 2009. It was also the first time that our big casino opened. And so it was like everybody was talking about the casino, and I was like, I'm not going to talk about it. Like, Jessica Kelly, you know, wrote that book and it's amazing. There's no way that I can like deal with that. I mean, she's already done such a good job. Like, I don't need to do that. She's writing about the Seminoles, right? So I decided, like, I'm not talking about casinos, but then everybody was talking about casinos because it was like, it was such, I mean, I remember going with my aunt to see it, and she's like, I can't believe this is Poarch. You know, like, it is like the biggest building within like 150 miles or something. It was a big deal. We live in rural Alabama, you know, like when I was growing up, we had to drive an hour to get to a movie. So it was like this big event, and people were super interested in it. And with that came some financial benefits for being a rural tribal member, scholarships, et cetera. And then maybe like a year later, we started getting what they called birthday checks, which were because other tribal communities, when they gave out a per cap, were targeted by, you know, predatory like car people and things like that. The chair at the time decided if we give people the check on their birthday month, then they won't be as targeted, right? And so we started getting birthday checks. And then all of a sudden, people were coming out of the woodwork, wanting to be tribal citizens. And so what became really interesting to me and what I really am talking about in this book manuscript is the way in which people define who belongs and who doesn't beyond like the legal definition of blood quantum. Because when my mom was in school, when she was in junior high, she went to an all Indian school. This was in the 1960s. Now Brown v. Board of Education happened in the 1950s, right? But when she's going to junior high, it is still completely segregated. So there's black schools, white schools, Indian schools, right? So, but the native school only went up to the 8th grade. And so when she got into high school, there were a bunch of them around the same generation who were integrating the white high school, along with black students as well. But during that time period, there were so many people who were being super racist against Native people. It was those people, a lot of them, who started trying to apply to be on the tribal roll. So then what happens is that people would say things like, "You will not believe who I just saw at the Indian Health Clinic," right? "I cannot believe this person has the nerve to show up because remember what they used to say about us," like those kinds of things. And it's not to say that these people didn't have Indian blood, it's to say that they were able to pass in a way that certain other members, like my mom, could not pass. And so they didn't experience the kind of racism and also participated in it. So people were mad. So one of the things that I think is really interesting is that people talk about BC or AC Indians before Casino or after Casino. They also call them the 3000s because all of their tribal roll numbers start with 3000. And it's become like, it's something that's really interesting to me is to think through like who is deciding to apply to be citizens. Why did they wait until now? What is their connection to that community? Because on the flip side of that, you have people who are not tribal citizens who grew up in and around Poarch, and people accept wholeheartedly, but they're not citizens, right? Like they don't have the blood quantum or whatever. And so that is like a little snapshot of what I'm interested in. Did I answer your question? Okay. Yes, I wrote about all of it. It's all really integrally tied together, and so it was really fascinating to write about education in Poarch and the fact that the first schools that were there were started by Episcopal missionaries in the 1930s, and then look at how like those schools became like the all Indian schools that continued until they started integrating the schools in the 1960s and 1970s. Yeah. Yes.
An honor to have you here. Appreciate it. Bring and most of the cleverness, I guess. When our president of the AAA made that talk last AAA meeting, that was our opening speech for the whole conference. So it's very impactful. Generated all kinds of conversation online and probably for decades. But also at the end of the AAA meeting, end of another session, this was all and there was a session dealing with some of these issues. And one of them in particular keeps coming to my mind because I haven't figured out how to resolve it or even think about it. So you're the one to help me go through this. Is that anthropologists often become cultural experts, like you're talking about. And so when the federal government, state government sets up structures to resolve issues, such as in the 40s and the 50s, land repatriation of monies to tribes, that whole process, and also the federal recognition process you just talked about. The structures are set up to where they need cultural experts on each side of the debate because it runs through like a legal procedure where you have vested parties. And anthropologists end up being hired on both sides. And so during the session, they were being very critical of anthropologists for saying things like, well, those people really are not that tribe, after I heard the evidence, I said, God, well, the political economic structure set up for us, the anthropologists, to be contending here. And so one side is always, from the native side, is always going to be derogatory, like we did something bad. But actually, we were professionals trying to, for that process to happen. So looks like we're in a no-win situation here. In the sense of a profession, we're always going to be competing because of the larger political structure set up, putting us in those walls. So, what's your thought on that past? Did that happen with your tribe?
Well, here's the thing, 20 Grays is the reason why we have federal recognition. So, I didn't really mention this before, but people in my community loved him. Like, he was such an important part of it because he was such an important part of that federal recognition process. And so I think, I guess my thought is that anthropologists are sometimes put in difficult situations, but I wouldn't take that job. Like, I wouldn't take the job to argue against a tribe, even if I didn't necessarily believe that they were who they said they were. I wouldn't take that job. And the thing about anthropologists and Native identity right now, Native identity is so fraught right now. There are people in Canada getting fired from their university positions for not being able to prove that they're Native, or that whoever they're claiming doesn't claim them back. And I think if you think about Kim Tallbear's work in particular about Native American DNA, she talks about, like, yeah, people are claiming these different identities, but unless a community is claiming you, you don't need to be claiming that. So I think that there is just so much going on right now. There is right now circulating on Google Docs a pretendian academia list. There's a list of all the people that people think are not really Native that are claiming that identity. And so I think for right now in this moment, it's so hard to think through that without thinking about all this baggage that goes along with what it means to claim an Indian identity. And that's not just for individuals, but also for communities. There is a book by Circe Sturm that you might want to look into called Becoming Indian, if you haven't read that before. She does such an amazing job because it's really about what she calls race shifters, people who are born something. Like, if you think about Rachel Dolezal or somebody like that, people who are born something but then start taking on this Native identity because they feel Cherokee in their heart, and specifically about Cherokees. Because if you are in any Indigenous community in North America, there's a huge joke that people always say they have a Cherokee Indian princess in their family, right? And so it's specifically about Cherokees. And the first half of the book is looking at all of these fraudulent Cherokee groups in all 50 states. Alaska, Hawaii also have fake Cherokee groups. And basically she sends out a survey to all of these people to be like, okay, tell me more, and she does interviews with a lot of them. But then the second half of the book is Cherokee Nation, the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, Eastern Band of Cherokee, and Kiowa Cherokee Nation from Oklahoma. Like, all of those three federally recognized Cherokee groups are talking about, like, their response to the people that they think are fraudulent Cherokees. So I just think that Native identity right now is just so complicated and so complex. I certainly don't have like an answer for your question, but I do think that looking at some of these resources, Kim Tallbear's Native American DNA, for example, some of these books that are really about Native identity might help you work through it a little bit better than I can. Sorry, I can't be helpful. Good question. I pretty much have decided that I'm not interested in working like solely with my tribe anymore. I think it's because we've not seen eye to eye on certain things, including the IRB.
and things like that. At some point, the Attorney General told me that it was fine if I wanted to do research there, but they were going to censor whatever I wanted to publish. So that was super hurtful. And like, I mean, just honestly, like going through that was just really hard. So what I'm interested in now is really about the way in which states and tribes interact, not necessarily federal like jurisdiction and tribes. Everybody, we're always talking about like federal jurisdiction on tribal lands, right? Like feds have this jurisdiction, states don't have this jurisdiction. In Alabama, that doesn't stop the good old boy network from trying to shut down the casino. It doesn't stop the Attorney General from sending state troopers to the casino doors to try to block people from going in or arrest people. It doesn't stop the Alabama state government from trying to badmouth the tribe, even as the tribe is bailing out the state for being bankrupt, right? Like these are the kinds of things. And so the article that we were talking about earlier about Poarch politics is really about the way in which Poarch has developed these PR campaigns to make local non-natives, to make Poarch more palatable for non-natives, and that's including government officials, by showing off like what the tribe has done for the community, the ways in which the tribe has contributed in X, Y, and Z ways. But it's really crazy because the same tribal officials who will badmouth Poarch and want to send the Attorney General to lock the doors are also the ones who are trying to let their buddy have their dog tracks and slot machines in the dog tracks, right? And have that be okay. And so it's like such a double standard. And I've read in a few places that there are other tribes that are really have been really economically successful, like Muckleshoot on Washington State. They have like a big banquet where they kind of are showing off like the goodwill and the donations that they make to the community as a way to make it more palatable for people who are non-native. And being in the Bible Belt, in the Jim Crow South, in this very particular place in rural Alabama, there is still so much anti-native racism where I'm from. There's a local creek that runs through that the tribe bought a big swath of land and like developed it with bathrooms, like picnic tables, like made it nice. So we go there, we can like shower off after we smell oil. The local white people were so mad, and the kind of anti-native racism that happened when that occurred was like actually kind of shocking to me because of how nasty people are being. So I'm just really interested in like the relationship between the state, between local communities, and also like the anti-sovereignty movements of those local, local counties, local municipalities, and the state, and the relationship between that and the tribe, even though they don't have jurisdiction there necessarily.
Forever watching here is an amazing talk and discussion and sharing. I'm going to easy. My question is about methods. We are the step that we have been through in your career, in your life as an anthropologist, but questioning the discipline and bringing new ideas and new ways to look at this thing and rethink it and decolonizing it. When you said about decolonizing, what is your approach to the traditional or conventional methods? That you question them, change them? For example, ethnography is a main method using anthropology. How do you view ethnography? Have you done it? Have you changed it?
That's a lovely question. Thank you so much. I hope I didn't give the impression that I think all anthropology is bad, because I don't. I just think that we really need to interrogate some very important questions when we're thinking about the discipline. When we're thinking about methods, I think that when we're thinking about ethnography, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with the methods that anthropologists use, but instead it's the way that they use them. And so when we're thinking about ethnography in particular, I wouldn't just show up at an elder's house and be like, hey, talk to me about this. I'll get my granny to call. Be like, can me and Kelly come
over for a conversation. And so one thing that I utilize a lot in my interviews was bringing my granny with me, especially when I was talking to older people, because I didn't have to really do anything except sit back and type. Because I would ask one question and they would start talking, and then I mean it was so much more ethnographically rich, you know, as we say, than if I had just been asking questions or being in charge. And so I kind of just let, you know, in those situations, let people decide what they wanted to tell me, as opposed to really pushing things. And I do remember talking to some people on my committee when I was getting ready to defend, and I told this story about how in the early 1900s, Poarch was such a poor community that when somebody died, they would take the front door off of people's houses and use that as a way to carry them. Like there wasn't enough money for coffins or, you know, making this kind of things. And so people like improvised, and everybody was like, oh my God, you gotta put that in there. And I was like, my community would not be happy. You know, like I don't want to put that in print. It's something that, you know, I use that kind of refusal that Audrey Simpson talks about, right? Like ethnographic refusal to say like, this is not something I feel comfortable writing about. And it's also not something I think the community would be okay with me talking about. And when I talked to my grandmother about it, she was like, yeah, go with that. And so I think that for me, when I'm thinking about ethnography, I just think about, hey, I don't necessarily need to be the driver. You know what I mean? Like, I don't necessarily, all of my questions don't have to be asked. And all of my questions aren't necessarily things that people want to hear or answer or think are relevant, honestly. And so I think for me, I just try to be, I just try to practice humility and say, like, what do you want to tell me? As opposed to having my list of scheduled questions and like checking them off, right? But I also think for me, it was kind of weird to do participant observation, right? Like as we think about it, because I had access to space as a tribal citizen that maybe a researcher shouldn't necessarily be a part of. And so whenever we tribal member only meetings about various issues from, you know, government matters or the tribal role or things like that, you know, it just, a lot of time I was constantly thinking like, is it okay for me to be here taking notes? And then a lot of that kind of stuff didn't end up in the dissertation because I ended up thinking like, I don't feel comfortable putting stuff that I gained because of my citizenship into this research, even though I had IRB approval from the tribe, right? Like, so I just feel like it's a delicate balance no matter what you do. But just really encourage people, especially graduate students, to think through what it looks like to be humble when you're in the field. I just feel like I've seen so many people who are so arrogant and think that they know everything, just like the song talks about, just like Mike Deloria talks about. That is my big thing. Is like, hey, don't just say that you know everything. You are a graduate student and you have a lot of skills and you have a wealth of knowledge, but you don't have more in the community that you're trying to study, right? Or that you're trying to work with. It just would be better. I don't know. You know what? That's a sore subject right now. I do have a mini sabbatical coming up next year that I hope is going to help me like finish everything up. So be on the lookout. That was super sweet. Though. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take this last one from online. What kind of advice would be given for students currently facing the unethical practices?
Will you read that one more time? Was it students?
It's a student, yeah. What kind of, Tina Duncan, she asked, what kind of advice would be given for students?
I think for me, the only reason why I made it through any of my programs was because of other Native women. And I think that finding your people is really important. Like the people who are gonna
understand like why you're having an issue and understand like why you want to try to work towards a solution. And so I say find your people first and foremost, because you need somebody to help fill your bucket, as the, you know, like the new emotional terminology is talking about, because, you know, institutions are slow moving, change is slow moving, and you have to be there for the marathon, not the sprint, right? And so in order to be able to do that, you have to have the people around you to support you. So find your allies, and then squeaky wheels do get action, I find. And don't be afraid for people to be mad at you. People are mad at me constantly. I mean, it is, you know, it does feel, and I am one of those people who actually like really wants people to like me. And so it's really hard sometimes when I know I have made people upset. At the same time, I want to be able to sleep at night, right? So, yeah.
For coming all the way from 6 degrees.
No, below
-6, -6.
Denver weather. I'm so glad that you made it for such a wonderful. I don't know if you were able to take questions from people who are shy to ask in front.
Oh, yeah,
like,
yeah,
maybe
yeah. I'll
if
hang
you
out here
safer.
for a minute. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
Thank you.